In today's video, we are looking at the RTX 4060 up against the AMD RX 7600. These don't cost quite the same, but they are the closest price competitors in the category. They're both 8GB graphics cards. They do have a few differences, and I will mention that I think between the two cooler models, these are what was sent to me for review, but AMD's reference model 7600 is a very small cooler, so if you see temperatures running a bit hotter there, keep in mind that other cooler model versions of it probably would do a little bit better, although keep in mind that it's also easier to cool a card that draws less power, which you will notice is true for the 4060. So it is easier to cool. And again, the other cooling will depend on the specific card you have. Now, also, how much do these cost in the current market? An RTX 4060, if I sort prices low to high, looks like the lowest price options are about $285. A few available at $290. The majority of options are closer to the MSRP of $300, but you definitely can get them for, you know, a $10 to $20 discount at times from their original MSRP. Again, the model I'm using in the video is the Asus Dual OC, which would be $305. And then RX 7600s are available as low as $260. With at least on a couple of models, and then they kind of go up to $270 and go up from there. So it's you're definitely paying less if you go the RX 7600 route. However, unlike in a lot of other GPU price class categories, AMD is not offering you more VRAM in the same category. These are both 8GB graphics cards, so something to keep in mind. And if we do look at the price difference as a percentage, I think that's usually a useful way to think about what kind of value the cards are offering. So if we look at 285 versus 260, we're seeing that the RTX 4060, if we compare lowest price options, is about 10% more expensive. So you're spending about 10% more money for the NVIDIA GPU. However, you are going to have a lot of feature set differences, and sometimes you will have a bit of a performance advantage, but you've also got differences in image quality, ray tracing, all of that, and we will be testing all of those things out in today's video. So I'm gonna go ahead and basically become a mouse cursor in case I wanna point at anything. We'll run the benchmarks. Currently here, we're looking at an Unreal Engine 5 title. This is RoboCop Rogue City at 1080p epic settings, and we see that both GPUs are a bit under 60 FPS at 52 and 56 respectively, with the 4060 taking an 8% advantage. So if you try turning down to high settings, both GPUs are now able to average above 60 FPS at 65 and 64 respectively. And interestingly, the 7600 goes from actually taking a bit of a loss at the epic settings to being ahead by 2%, which is only 1 frame per second, at the high settings. So it's true that sometimes they will scale a bit differently depending on the graphics settings used in the game. What if we move up to 1440p resolution though? Well, Unreal Engine 5 is very kind of per pixel calculated in a lot of its big feature set, which means that resolution greatly impacts performance. We're seeing performance go all the way down to 37 and 31 respectively for the average FPS, which is a 19% lead for the 4060. However, I don't think this is necessarily how you would play the game on either GPU. The frame rates are too low. So what if you go ahead and kick on FSR and DLSS at the quality setting? These do not produce identical image quality, but frame rate goes up a lot for both of them. However, keep your eye on the left-hand side of the screen for some flickering in the street, some kind of temporal instability, the grading and things. So it's definitely a better, more stable image on the DLSS image. And the 4060's lead is actually at 8% now at 56 versus 52, although they're tied in the 1% lows. If you didn't want to use upscaling, you could reduce settings, but even dropping down to the high settings from the epic settings does not produce as large of a performance jump as using upscaling did. Unreal Engine 5 is very, like I said, resolution dependent. So we can only get to 42 FPS, but it is a tie on both GPUs by dropping down to the high settings. So you'd probably need to kick on upscaling from there as well if you wanted to get some over 60 FPS gameplay. So that's what I tried out here. So if we look at FSR and DLSS, again, both at the quality settings, so the same internal resolution, although again, I think the image looks a lot less stable on the FSR side of the screen here. We are getting a similar performance, though, 2% lead for the 7600, but with an image quality advantage to the 4060. I would consider this a bit of a win for the 4060 since it looks better at roughly the same performance. But not every new popular game is as demanding as Unreal Engine 5 titles. So if we look at one of the most popular single-player PC games in a long time, with Baldur's Gate 3 at 1080p ultra settings, even in the demanding Baldur's Gate City, both GPUs are doing very well at 89 and 83 FPS respectively, which is a 7% advantage to the 7600, although the 4060 has a lead in the 1% lows. We're seeing a similar split at 1440p, where the 7600 takes a lead in the average FPS by 7% at 65 versus 61, but the 4060 takes a lead in the 1% lows at 49 versus 42, but both are over 60 FPS at 1440p. Look at the frame time graph on the AMD GPU. Do you see these tiny little spikes at regular intervals? And we're not seeing that on the frame time graph for the 4060, and that's been the case for a lot of my AMD versus NVIDIA testing in that title. I am using the DX11 mode for the game for your reference. Now, what if we move to Starfield? At 1080p ultra settings, well, we're looking at another very demanding title. Neither GPU is able to hit 60 FPS at 1080p ultra in New Atlantis that I'm testing here. It's 44 versus 43, so 2% lead for the 7600, but the 1% lows are larger, 12% lead at 37 versus 33. Now, if you enable upscaling, which I had turned off in the previous scene, keep in mind the game would default to enabling upscaling. When I say 1080p Ultra, I meant without upscaling. But if you do enable upscaling at the quality level, so 67% resolution scaling per axis, we are seeing 51 FPS on both GPUs. So they're tied in the averages, but the 1% lows are now better for the 7600 at 17% advantage. What if you wanted to use frame generation? Well, one reason I'm looking at this is because this is one of the games that has both FSR3 and DLSS 3 frame generation. And here we're seeing that AMD, I think I'm going to actually pause the playback here for just a second to talk about this enough. So frame generation, first of all, I do have a little note to read here. While we're seeing much higher frame rates, remember that these are not equivalent to achieving that frame rate without using frame generation. Because normally boosting frame rate improves responsiveness, whereas frame generation does not. And there can also be some image quality artifacts as the game is basically interpolating between two frames. So it slightly delays showing you a frame to then kind of average the result of that frame with the previous frame to show you an interpolated in-between frame. So that's what's happening here. Also, the baseline upscalers are still happening, and we still see some of the, upscaling differences of image quality between the two upscalers. And now there's also difference in the quality of the generated frames with the frame interpolation, and also with the frame pacing when those frames are delivered. So there's a lot going on here, but it does look like FSR3 is generating more total frames. So we are seeing the 7600 taking a frame rate advantage here by 18% in the averages and 46% in the 1% lows. But keep in mind that the image quality and frame pacing is not necessarily identical, and it's very difficult to communicate adequately in video footage without kind of experiencing it in person on a variable refresh rate display. If you don't want to use all of the upscaling and frame generation trickery, you could just go to 1080p medium settings at native resolution. And now both GPUs are over 60 FPS at 66 and 70 respectively. It's now the 4060 taking the lead by 6% in the averages, but the 1% lows are still an 8% advantage to the 7600. If we move up to 1440p resolution, the ultra settings are very demanding, and we're seeing both GPUs in the mid-30s at 36 and 34 respectively, 6% lead for the 7600, and an 11% lead in the 1% lows for the 7600 at 31 versus 28. But I really just don't think that these are the settings people would choose to use to play the game, at least for most people. We would be chasing a higher frame rate. If you enable quality level upscaling, where again, differences in image quality, and I would still say advantage DLSS, we are getting frame rates boosted into the mid-40s. So definitely more playable, although I still think a lot of people would chase higher frame rates. If comparing the two, we're seeing 1 FPS advantage to the 7600, which is a 2% lead here, and 9% lead in the 1% lows at 36 versus 33. If we drop all the way down to the medium preset, we're now getting closer to that 60 FPS line, but still not achieving it at 50 and 52 respectively, 4% lead for the 4060, although still a 13% lead for the 7600 and the 1% lows at 45 versus 40. We're seeing even dropping all the way down to medium settings, these aren't 60 FPS GPUs in Starfield at medium settings. So what if you kick on upscaling on top of dropping to the medium settings? Now we're able to do it. So here we're seeing 64 versus 71 FPS. So actually the 4060 is now taking the lead by 11%. And the 1% lows are only a 2% lead now for the 7600 at 55 versus 54. And again, image quality advantage, I would say, to DLSS as well. So let's go ahead and kick on frame generation again, because again, once you get a baseline frame rate around the 60 FPS area, which we had, then frame generation is often worth the small downsides in order to get kind of smooth things out on high refresh rate display. So all of the same caveats I talked about last time we talked about with frame generation, and once again, we are seeing FSR3 seeming to deliver more total frames generated. Now let's go ahead and move on to Avatar, which is another AMD-sponsored title using a different engine. This is now the Snowdrop engine from Ubisoft, and this game does include ray tracing at all times, although it's a console-focused level of ray tracing, so not super demanding. 4060 takes a 10% lead in the averages, but a much more noticeable lead in the 1% lows at 38 versus 22. But neither one's doing great at 1080p Ultra. So if we drop down to 1080p High, we seem to be more at these GPUs' speed. And again, this does still include ray tracing. This game will always include ray tracing. And we're seeing 59 versus 53 FPS, so 11% lead for the 4060. The 1% lows have now stabilized quite a bit at 47 versus 43. It's possible that at the Ultra settings we're seeing more VRAM issues, and I've noticed that AMD seems to handle VRAM spillover a little less gracefully in some titles than NVIDIA does, and I think that may have been what we saw at the Ultra settings. Speaking of Ultra settings, if we go to 1440p Ultra, neither GPU is able to average over 30 frames per second. We're at 29 and 28 respectively, which is a 4% advantage to the 4060. The 1% lows are an 8% advantage, which is 2 FPS at 26 versus 24. So really those just aren't the settings that you would use to play the game. So what if you use upscaling? Well, it helps out quite a bit, but still maybe not as far as you'd want to go. And once again, image quality advantage for DLSS. It's a 10% performance lead for the 4060 at 45 versus 41. For image quality stuff, look at like the fence gratings and things like that here. You'll notice they're a lot more stable on the DLSS side of the image. The 1% lows are also a 9% lead for the 4060 at 38 versus 35. But I still don't quite think that this is where people would want to be. We could try reducing settings down to the high settings, but without upscaling, we're still not performing that well. We're at 41 versus 37, so 11% advantage of the 4060. Again, this does include ray tracing, where NVIDIA typically has an advantage. And the 1% lows are a 10% lead by 34 FPS to 31, so 3 FPS advantage, which is 10%. Now, if we go to enable the upscaling on the high settings as the baseline, the 4060 at least is now able to hit 60 FPS, taking a 15% lead over the 7600 at 60 FPS versus 52. And the 1% lows are 47 versus 44. Once again, I would also give an image quality advantage to DLSS, again, especially if you're paying attention to the fine detail in the like fencing details and things like that. Now, if we are achieving roughly 60 FPS, we can then enable frame generation. Now, this game doesn't have DLSS 3 frame generation, but does have FSR frame generation. So both GPUs have to switch to the FSR pathway to enable frame generation. So now they have identical image quality. And actually, their performance level's out at 88 FPS as well, although the 1% lows are better on the 7600. Let's go ahead and move to a more demanding ray tracing test. If we move to Cyberpunk's RT Overdrive mode, even with quality level upscaling, neither GPU is doing great, although it is relatively a massive lead for the 4060 at 38 versus 13. I just don't think many people would be playing a first-person shooter-style combat game like this at 38 FPS. I know some people might do it to experience the path tracing mode, but a lot of people would choose not to. So, including myself, so I would drop down to a lower ray tracing mode. If you just enable the Ultra Graphics preset and then enable a single ray tracing effect, I would choose RT Reflections, which show off a lot in Cyberpunk. Now the 4060 is very playable at 55 FPS. The 7600 is playable at 42, but that is a 31% advantage for the 4060 and a 38% lead in the 1% lows. And if you're willing to use upscaling at 1080p, which I'd rather avoid, but it looks a lot better on DLSS, especially if you look at the fence we were just going by there, kind of the gate and the fence and things like that. It's a much more stable image on the right-hand side of the screen. It's a 30% performance lead as well for the 4060, and our frame rates are now fairly high at 86 and 66 respectively. So very playable, but again, I'm not a huge fan of upscaling at 1080p, but at least with DLSS, it's a choice that some people might choose to use. At 1080p Ultra, meaning what if we just turn off all of the ray tracing, turn off all of the upscaling, and just play the game? Both GPUs do pretty well, but it's actually advantage for the RX 7600 by 9% at 82 versus 75. The 1% lows are 64 versus 54, which is a 19% advantage for the 7600. At 1440p Ultra settings, we're seeing 51 versus 45 FPS, which is a 13% advantage for the 7600, and a 17% lead in the 1% lows at 42 versus 36. But again, while this is definitely playable on both GPUs, I think a lot of people would be chasing higher frame rates than 51 and 45, although, some people might be fine with it. So there's a couple of options. One option would be to enable upscaling, FSR and DLSS at the quality setting, and interestingly, the 7600 seems to benefit more from the upscaling at these settings. And now it takes a 20% lead at 67 versus 56, although the image quality, once again, I would say is an advantage to DLSS, where things are looking a little bit more shimmery on the FSR image, less temporal stability. But there's another option for gaining frames, which would just be to turn down normal settings without lowering the rendering resolution. And we can do that by going down to high settings. Now at high settings, the 7600 is able to hit 59 FPS in the built-in benchmark and 55 on the 4060, which is a 7% advantage to AMD and a 9% lead in the 1% lows at 50 versus 60. Now, interestingly, if we try upscaling from the high settings as a baseline, it's actually now for the 4060 that benefits more from the upscaling performance boost. So it really just depends on the settings you're using, it seems. And now they're both, boosting quite a bit, but the 4060 takes the lead by 5% at 87 versus 83, and a 3% advantage in the 1% lows at 68 versus 66. But again, an image quality advantage to the DLSS side of the screen, where again, things just look a little more stable, less flickering. And let's move on to Alan Wake 2, which interestingly doesn't offer a native TAA pathway. You have to choose FSR or DLSS. And so I did, respectively, because I think that's the choices that users of these GPUs would make. So even at native resolution here, which is what we're looking at, there are image quality differences, which I would still say is a slight advantage to DLSS, although at native resolution it's maybe not a huge difference. And we're at an 11% performance lead for the 7600, although it was losing in the 1% lows. I did try going down to low settings, though, to see if we could get closer to 60 FPS, and we do. The 7600 takes a 61 FPS average, which is 9% lead over the 56 FPS on the 4060, but they're both close to 60. But the 1% lows are a bigger lead for the 4060. Look at the frame time graph for AMD here. It's very spiky. There's some spikes on the NVIDIA frame time graph, but much fewer. So definitely a more spiky, which would in gameplay be a little bit more a more stuttery experience. And if we enable ray tracing, that's accelerated even more. But if we take the high preset and add on ray tracing at the low settings, but then try to kick on upscaling to make up for it, well, it still doesn't quite make up for it. We're at 37 and 25 FPS respectively, so I don't think I'd really use these settings on either GPU. But it is a large performance, a relative lead for the 4060, but I just don't think I'd use those settings. If we move up to the high settings at native resolution, FSR versus DLSS respectively, I think this is an example of AMD handling running out of VRAM less gracefully than NVIDIA is in this title, because I think that's what's happening. because you see a lot of the typical stutters you would see from running out of VRAM, especially on the AMD side of the screen, and they're just less pronounced on the right-hand side of the screen, leading to a large difference in the 1% lows. But I don't think those are the settings anybody would be using anyway. So what if we drop down to the low settings to try to boost performance? Well, for performance does go up. We're at 40 and 39 respectively now. These spikes in the frame time graph are reduced, but there's still more of them on the AMD side of the screen, which may or may not be VRAM now at the low settings. Could just be, again, that I find the 1% lows to not perform particularly well here on AMD hardware. And that's kind of across the board in my testing. Now, if we use quality level upscaling with FSR versus DLSS again, so same kind of image quality things, if we look at the fence grading and things like that, I think it is more stable on the DLSS side of the image. Performance now is now close to that 60 FPS mark with 66 on the 7600, giving it a 14% advantage over the 58 FPS on the 4060, but the frame time graph is still smoother for the 4060, giving it a 24% advantage in the 1% lows. And I will mention this game does have DLSS 3 frame generation, and if we enable it, from a almost 60 FPS baseline, it does give a reasonable experience. Now, AMD doesn't have a frame generation technology implemented in this game, but they do have driver-level AFMF, so I'm showing results on that, but I will say the quality of that frame generation is much lower than an FSR3 implementation or a DLSS 3 implementation. So personally, probably wouldn't be using it. Now, if we look at Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3 at 1080p basic settings, I am using the basic settings rather than the extreme settings here, because I think that's more like how people would play a competitive multiplayer game, try to chase high frame rates. We are getting pretty high frame rates, and it's an 18% advantage for the 7600 at 209 versus 177. If we move up to 1440p resolution, stay at the basic settings, we have a 15% advantage for the for the 7600 at 142 versus 124, and the 1% lows are a 38% lead at 98 versus 71, although that really only accelerates to that large of a difference at the very end of this benchmark run when the screen kind of flashes. You see the 4060 kind of takes a dip in the 1% lows that the AMD GPU does not. If we move on to a little bit more Unreal Engine 5 testing, we do see Immortals of Aveum at 1080p Ultra, averaging 49 and 53 respectively, giving an 8% advantage to the 4060, and an 8% lead in the 1% lows at 40 versus 37. This was one of the first Unreal Engine 5 games to feature all of the full, a set of features, Lumen, Nanite, all of that. If we move up to 1440p resolution, performance drops quite a bit, again, as we've usually seen with Unreal Engine 5 titles, where they are very resolution dependent for performance. So here we're at 35 versus 32, and that's a 9% lead for the 4060. The 1% lows are 26 and 25, giving a 1 FPS or 4% advantage to the 7600. But probably not the way you would play the game at those frame rates. So if we kick on quality level upscaling, once again, the usual image quality differences do apply in this game as well, where I think things look a bit more stable and less fizzly on the DLSS side of the screen. Performance jumps considerably. We're now at 56 and 44 respectively, so 27% advantage to the 4060. And also in the 1% lows at 26% advantage at 43 versus 34. Now, it was one of the first games to feature both FSR3 and DLSS3 frame generation. So if we go ahead and kick that on, we can once again see that there are frame pacing differences. Here, especially in the 1% lows, we're seeing advantage to the 4060. And this is also an older FSR3 implementation where the frame pacing worked a bit differently, especially when you were not VSync locked. And so this is, like I said, a bit of an older implementation of that. Now, if we move to one more Unreal Engine 5 title with Lords of the Fallen, this is the most demanding Unreal Engine 5 title at its ultra settings that I test at least. And here we're seeing 35 and 40 FPS respectively at 1080p Ultra. So they're not doing real great at those settings. It's a 14% lead for the 4060 and a 10% advantage in the 1% lows at 34 versus 31. If we go ahead and kick on upscaling, though, we do see performance get closer to 60 FPS at 59 and 52 respectively, so 13% advantage to the 4060, 4% lead in the 1% lows at 46 versus 44. So again, Unreal Engine 5 benefits a lot from upscaling. I don't love upscaling at 1080p though, especially on the FSR side of things, where I think things get a little fizzly, especially around the character model as they move. But you could also drop down to high settings, for example, and that gets us to 56 and 50 FPS respectively without needing any upscaling, which would probably be my preference at 1080p resolution, especially if I was looking at the AMD side of things, because I would want to probably avoid FSR at 1080p. It gives a 12% performance lead to the 4060 at 56 versus 50, and 10% lead in the 1% lows at 46 versus 42. Could move up to 1440p resolution, but don't try out the ultra settings. You're not going to break 30 FPS. We're at 27 versus 24, which is a 13% advantage to the 4060 and a 10% lead in the 1% lows at 23 versus 21. So definitely not the frame rates most people would be choosing to play the game at. So again, this being Unreal Engine 5 and very, performance scaling on resolution, we'll go ahead and lower the rendering resolution by kicking on FSR and DLSS quality. This bumps performance quite a bit, but still only to 45 and 39 respectively, giving a 15% advantage to the 4060 and a 12% advantage in the 1% lows at 38 versus 34. Upscaling can only go so far. You could use it more aggressively, or you could try turning down settings. But turning down to the high settings, which keeps most of your big Unreal Engine 5 features just at reduced settings, so you still get lumen and stuff. We're at 38 versus 34, which is 12% lead for the 4060, but just really not that great of frame rates. So in general, you would probably actually want to upscale from here, but I think I kind of just forgot to also upscale at 1440p on my 7600 when I went down to the high settings, so I don't have those results for you. Apologies, but we'll move on to the RE engine. With Resident Evil 4 Remake at 1080p prioritized graphics, both GPUs do great at 108 versus 103, 5% advantage to the 4060. 4% lead in the 1% lows at 99 versus 95, but overall it's pretty close. I'm not testing out the ray tracing here because it uses a lot of VRAM. These are 8GB cards, and honestly, it doesn't look very good anyway. So we'll go ahead and move on to 1440p at prioritized graphics settings, which is 73 versus 71. And it's a 3% advantage at the 4060, and 2% lead in the 1% lows at 66 versus 65. So again, basically a tie here in Resident Evil 4 Remake. Okay, I think those are the benchmarks that I ran for you guys today. I'll pop out quickly for some final thoughts. So my final thoughts are, if you offered me both GPUs at the same price, I would absolutely take the 4060. There are some games, if we kind of scroll through and look at those percentage differences, it's not that the 7600 never takes some performance advantages. It certainly does. But I would say more typically, they're either about the same or it's a small performance lead for the 4060, especially in like our Unreal Engine 5 games, where a lot of games are going to be coming out on Unreal Engine 5. And then especially if you're in the more demanding games, especially if you're trying to play at 1440p resolution, you would often probably be needing to kick on DLSS or FSR upscaling, at least if you want to keep reasonably high graphics settings. And if that's the case, and especially if you're going to have to end up doing it at 1080p resolution, I think the image quality advantages for DLSS are pretty noticeable here. So unlike at other graphics performance tiers, where sometimes AMD's offering more VRAM at the same price, where I really would rather have, more than 8GB of VRAM here, but both of these are 8GB cards. There is a 7600 XT that's a 16GB card, but that's also significantly more expensive, and I've already done a separate video analyzing that. So when the performance is close, and often a little bit of a lead for the 4060, but then you have the feature set advantages for the 4060. You also have, more energy efficiency and things like that. I would definitely prefer to have the 4060 if I was choosing between the two GPUs at the same price. Now, they don't cost the same. The 4060 does cost about 10% more if you compare the lowest priced models of both GPUs that are currently available new. So would I pay 10% more for the 4060? Well, often it does even have a 10% performance lead, although it certainly doesn't average a 10% performance lead. It would be a more single-digit performance lead. But then when you kick on the feature set advantages with DLSS and things like that, and there's no advantage to VRAM or anything like that for AMD, again, I do think it is worth 10% more money than the 7600. That being said, I feel like both of these GPUs are overpriced. I'm not excited by either of these. Like I said, I don't love 8 gigabytes of VRAM. Now, the lower the price goes, the more okay with that I am. But just in general, looking at how these stack up against the more demanding new like Unreal Engine 5 games. I mean, 1080p Ultra hitting 40 FPS and 35 FPS in Lords of the Fallen. Not super impressive, right? RoboCop Rogue City was a bit less demanding, but they're still under a 60 FPS average at 1080p. And again, that's just asking for 1080p. So I don't know. When you get close to $300 and have to turn down settings at 1080p, obviously not in every game, but in general, I'm hoping next generation offers something a bit more exciting in this price class, because I think it's hard to get really excited about either of these GPUs. Although let's be clear that especially if you just adjust settings appropriately, you can definitely get reasonable performance on both of these. But I mean, again, like 1080p Ultra in Starfield, for example, the GPUs are in the mid 40s. Like it's just hard to get super excited about either of these. But I do think if the price difference is 10% and you're choosing between them, I do think the 4060 is worth 10% more money for its feature set advantages and similar but maybe slightly better overall performance depending on the game. I hope you guys found this video useful and or interesting, and I hope all of you have an excellent day.